And I would say that it was only in the last 18 months, 2 years, that she really lost touch with her backbenchers. What's worrying for Boris Johnson is that this has happened quickly. This shouldn't be happening with a majority of 80, and he's still only been Prime Minister for 18 months, and he's only had that majority for a year.
To get Brexit done.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
Hello, this is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Lord Moore. Lord Moore was the editor of The Spectator, The Daily Telegraph, and The Sunday Telegraph. He is also the official biographer of Margaret Thatcher. We're going to be talking about Margaret Thatcher, Boris Johnson, and the Crown. Thank you so much, Lord Moore, for joining us.
Thank you.
It's almost 30 years to the day, around this week, that Margaret Thatcher resigned as Prime Minister. She was in that job for 11 years. Can you talk about the significance of that moment for Britain?
Well, the important thing about her going was, I think, the manner in which she went, because you have to remember that she'd won all the general elections that she had contested as leader of the Conservative Party. That's 3 general elections, and she'd won them big. And then, but when she went, she hadn't lost anything. And of course, that she felt that very strongly. And the funny thing is, she hadn't even lost the leadership election, which caused her to leave. It's quite a good trick quiz question. Who got the most votes in the Tory leadership election of 1990? And the answer is Margaret Thatcher. She got more than Michael Heseltine, who challenged her, and she got more than John Major, who won in the second ballot after she'd resigned, and yet she still had to go. And this, of course, was very difficult for her to understand and accept. And it illustrated a wider point, which was that there was a sort of coup against her. I don't mean an illegitimate, illegal thing, but it was a sort of coup within the Conservative Party rather than the decision of the people. And that, I think, created a lot of bad blood within the Conservative Party. And that sort of spilt out into lots of subsequent difficulties about, how we would best be governed. And it created a sort of myth of betrayal. When I say myth, I don't mean lie, but a sort of legend, a story about betrayal, which has continued, though I now think it has calmed down, just recently calmed down. But, it's a long time. And it's a big thing to throw out a prime minister in that way, and particularly a world famous, very important prime minister, and particularly a prime minister with a huge parliamentary majority. So this was a very odd event and a very traumatic one.
Now, Mrs Thatcher's most loyal supporters, as you say, talk about this idea of betrayal. And there is this view among some that these sort of mediocre male MPs who are a bit het up about Europe and a few other issues decided to, remove, as you say, this prime minister who had won so many elections and won their seats in parliament, for example. What do you make of this view? Do you think it was unjust in the end, or was it time for her to go?
I think it could be both. I think you could say it was both. I think it was more or less time for her to go. 11 and a half years is a very long time. Things were going wrong in the last 18 months of her time. The poll tax, for example, and also increasingly bad personal relations with senior colleagues, such as Geoffrey Howe. Everybody has their day, and she'd had a long day. And things weren't going to get better, I think. On the other hand, it was unjust. It was an unjust way of proceeding for someone who'd done so much for them. And it made everybody involved look bad. And it had a big element of skullduggery, because I think the important thing that I discovered about the facts of this story in my biography is that it is true that the key people getting rid of her were not the people who directly challenged her, led by Michael Heseltine, but the people who were in her government and therefore theoretically loyal to her, who felt that she should go. Now, I think their reasons were quite legitimate reasons, but their methods were pretty naughty and sort of undercover, and they were edging her to the door while telling her that she was wonderful and they were supporting her. That made things very difficult. So I think the the betrayal story is sort of true, but you do have to qualify it on the other side with, politics is a rough old game, and probably it was time for her to go.
Now, obviously, you've mentioned that she was pretty upset, obviously, as anyone would be, at what happened on a personal level. How did she react to the event, and how did her views change throughout the years after she was Prime Minister?
Her immediate reaction to the event was very brave and spirited, and she made that tremendous performance in the House of Commons. Labour had foolishly called a no confidence debate, and on the day she announced her resignation, she could then do this bravura performance as she was going, which made everybody think, why on earth are we getting rid of her? And it worked beautifully. And she was also buoyed up in the immediate, very short term by wanting John Major to win once she had decided to go, because she didn't want Heseltine, and she thought Major was a Thatcherite. She was wrong about that, by the way. So that buoyed her up, and she was very pleased when John Major did win 30 years ago this week. So that was all sort of rather splendid, but it didn't last, because really she was devastated by what had happened. And I would say that she effectively had a nervous breakdown after leaving office. She couldn't adjust. One thing she couldn't adjust to was not having enough to do. All her life, she'd been, really all her life from, teenager, she'd been fantastically busy, and she'd worked and worked and worked. And one of the things she loved about being in Number 10, and she did love it, which some prime ministers don't love it actually, was this sense of being able to do things all the time and to have effects, and she loved actual actions. And suddenly she couldn't. So she just jolly well did not know what to do with herself. And she felt, of course, the sense of betrayal and loss and so on. And so for some time, she was all over the place. She couldn't make decisions. She couldn't focus. She would talk and talk and talk without much effect. She couldn't plan things. She couldn't agree things. She couldn't decide how to write her memoirs, who should publish them, almost everything. She couldn't really decide at first. And to a greater or lesser degree, this problem continued for quite a long time. Then she got more equilibrium, and she became pretty effective in politics as, to use her unfortunate phrase, a backseat driver. And of course, that's also made her very unpopular with the Tory hierarchy, because, she was a thorn in their side. And increasingly, she rebelled on the European issue, and said so. Most of what she thought about that, except for one key thing, which I'll come to, she said it publicly. This caused great resentment, and I think it's fair to say that John Major was badly treated by her, because she'd been badly treated by Edward Heath, whom she'd replaced, and in a way she did the same to Major. More on issues of principle perhaps than Heath had done, but nevertheless very, very awkward for Major. She was quite well engaged as a backbencher and then as a peer, and doing a lot of things, and of course making enormous numbers of important speeches all over the world, because she's a global figure. And then, as you know, her mental powers declined starting at the end of the 20th century. And really in the 21st century, she couldn't take part in public affairs anymore. And her decline was sad, but it had one good effect, which is that she stopped thinking, I must get back to Number 10 Downing Street. And she became rather a sweet old lady, because she had this rather sort of domestic side to her. And, in the last years when I would see her, she was interested in things like feeding the dog and how nice the flowers were, and that sort of thing, living by the moment, and ceasing to agonize about not being in office.
How much did this event of her resignation and what the MPs did to her, how much did that tarnish, in your view, her overall reputation and legacy in the 11 years she was Prime Minister?
Well, I think if she had left of her own free will, her reputation would stand higher, certainly, because she would have had this great myth of invincibility. And indeed, when I met her shortly after she left office and she was starting to think about writing her memoirs, I said, what are you going to call them? and she said undefeated. And the reason for that was that she was undefeated, not only in the general elections I've described, also, as I've also said, in the leadership election, which caused her to go. So that feeling of invincibility, which she strongly had, was nevertheless not quite borne out by the facts, because she had been pushed out. And also it was clear that though her government hadn't run out of road by 1990, it was doing a lot, and the European stuff, the controversial, was very important. And the Iraq War came immediately afterwards, which she'd been preparing for and which Britain helped to win, the first Gulf War. Nevertheless, it was getting more difficult, and her reputation was falling. It had fallen for the last 18 months of her time in office. So her record was blemished because of what happened. But it also sort of, in some funny way, it also contributed to the sense of loyalty that she commanded among many other people, because there's always been the feeling that Mrs. Thatcher was an outsider who the establishment wanted to get. And this was confirmed by the way she was kicked out. And it also had to do with the fact that she was the one and only woman. And there was a sort of misogynist element against her all the time, which somehow thought, it's not right that a woman should have power. And quite nasty words, very nasty words were used sometimes, about ditch and all that sort of thing, which seemed to play into her sex and a disparagement of the fact that she was a woman. So I think the sort of tragedy of it also firmed up sympathy for her, as well as showing her faults and her vulnerability.
This idea of anti-elitism is something I really want to get into later on in the interview. But just to stick on Thatcher's resignation, how did she manage to alienate so many of her own MPs in the end? What was the reason for that?
I think there are two separate issues here. One is backbenchers and the other is cabinet colleagues and ministers. Backbenchers obviously fundamentally concerned to keep their seats, and that's the primary thing in the back of their minds. And when things go wrong, it starts to be at the front of their minds. And that's what happened due to the so-called Lawson boom going wrong and to the poll tax. So they were getting very, very twitchy about all of that, and also feeling she'd been around too long. The cabinet colleagues also felt she'd been around too long, but their anxieties were different from those of backbenchers. They'd all agreed on the poll tax, and they couldn't really get out of it. And it wasn't the big issue in their minds, though they were very worried about it. The big issue in their minds, apart from personal differences with her, was Europe. The great majority of the people in the cabinet were very pro-European integration. Though they were a little skeptical about the creation of the single currency, they were basically in favor of moving in that direction. They didn't like falling out with Germany. They didn't like falling out with France. They wanted more or less to agree with Jacques Delors, who was pushing it all forward. And they saw a European future for Britain. And Mrs. Thatcher really increasingly didn't. And this was the thing I said I'd come to later, that after she left office, she actually became in favor of leaving the EU, though she decided never to say it publicly because of the division it would cause. But it was clear her direction of travel was clear. And it's clear to me in my studies for this that ministers who felt strongly about these matters, Douglas Hurd, Chris Patten, a lot of them, plus of course Heseltine from the outside, and actually John Major, much more than people realised, really didn't want her to go this way. And of course, famously, Geoffrey Howe didn't, and he resigned over that issue. So that was the key factor, and that I think is the bit that, much more than the whole poll tax argument, that has lasted. So that revealed a fissure which went on. You could argue it's going on right now, but I think the fundamental thing that sort of settled that was Boris's victory in the last general election, with a stonking majority for a Brexit position. Of course, we still haven't fully left, and the last crisis is about to hit us. But I think the Conservative Party has now basically acknowledged that it is the party of Brexit, not a word that Mrs. Thatcher was familiar with, of course, but a concept she supported. And so in that sense, she has won a posthumous victory.
And you've brought us right to today, and this is exactly what I wanted to talk about, because you've recently talked about the differences and similarities between Boris Johnson's premiership and Margaret Thatcher. And you've said one of the similarities is that both of them seem to have alienated their own members of parliament. Can you talk about how Boris Johnson may have done that? And is he any threat to his leadership? I know he's only been there for a year or so.
I think the last point you make is the key difference. Mrs Thatcher didn't alienate her MPs always, or from the first, though she always had a substantial minority of critics in her parliamentary party. But she proved again and again she could succeed, and therefore she was sort of there on sufferance, even with the critics. And I would say that it was only in the last 18 months, 2 years, that she really lost touch with her backbenchers, which tends to happen if you're in office for too long. I think it happened to Tony Blair as well. What's worrying for Boris Johnson is that this has happened quickly. This shouldn't be happening with a majority of 80, and he's still only been Prime Minister for 18 months, and he's only had that majority for a year, a bit less than a year. So this shouldn't be happening now. On the other hand, by the same token, because it's so early, he's not finished by any means. I mean, he has extremely good chance of pulling through this. Why on earth would the Tories want to hurl themselves into another contest of any description when they don't have to have a general election for 4 more years? Crazy, absolutely crazy. And of course, though he's very unpopular with a lot of them, people do recognise that the COVID situation is unprecedented, and you can't treat it like normal politics. So you get a huge amount of excitement and discontent at present, but I would say that it hasn't got right to the root of things yet. I wouldn't say that Boris is on the skids. What I think is true is that there's a considerable loss of confidence, and just very, very high level of anxiety. And of course, not just among Tory MPs, but in the whole country, about the situation, not primarily about Boris, but partly about Boris, but about the economic situation, the COVID situation, exactly what will happen with Brexit. A lot of the woke agenda, I think, is very alarming to a lot of people. And I think the rise of China and China's role in COVID, these are all things that people are very, very anxious about. And they feel the West is not doing well, and there's been constant rows in America and so on. So there's every possible thing to worry about right now.
Well, he's got a lot on his plate, as you rightly mentioned, all of those issues. And in many people's views this year, Boris Johnson, and I think a lot of Tory backbenchers would agree with this view, Boris Johnson didn't step up to the mark. He didn't quite show enough leadership. There was a lot of U-turns. Communications were poor. There's been a lot of internal infighting in Downing Street. And, a lot of people say, is this man up to the job? Has he got the competence to be able to run the country? Now, obviously, as you say, coronavirus is an unprecedented pandemic for at least, in over 100 years now. So he's got a lot of slack in that sense, and people are sort of willing to forgive mistakes. How long can that last? And do you think that, I find this issue of sort of significance in politicians interesting. Margaret Thatcher was a hugely charismatic leader, and she obviously was very sort of intriguing and had this huge sense of authority around her. Whereas Boris Johnson, I don't know if he quite has that, or if anyone has that today. So can you talk about how long Boris Johnson's can last going down the sort of path that he has this year, of a whole series of chaos and errors, and also this issue of, can he be this great, inspiring leader like Margaret Thatcher was?
Well, he certainly can't be a leader like Margaret Thatcher. He is not like Margaret Thatcher, for better and for worse. So, for example, he's got a sort of very original and I think brilliant sense of humour, which nobody accused her of having. But equally, he doesn't have one of her strongest qualities was a sense of direction. You always knew essentially what the sort of thing it was she was trying to achieve. Endless rows about how to achieve it, and she was quite good tactically about that. And she made some retreats as well as advances. But she was going, and she had a purpose and a massively strong will. And that's clearly less the case with Boris, as it actually is less the case with most prime ministers. She was very exceptional in that way. Many of them do tend to live by the week or even the day, and get sort of caught up in all of that. We have a hypercritical media world in Britain, more than most continental countries. And so you have to lay off a bit for that, because actually I think the striking thing about Western powers dealing with COVID is not how different they've been, but how similar. So there are differences, and the Germans would appear to have done a lot better than us. But broadly speaking, Spain, Italy, France, Belgium, Netherlands, it's all, and in a slightly different way, United States, Australia, all made big mistakes, made quite similar mistakes quite often. There is no clever answer to it. And I think if you did take a detached view, you would see that Britain was just one of the many that had suffered a lot, rather than some sort of one-off terrible, unique foul-up. What next, though? I mean, the economic stuff is very, very serious, as Rishi Sunak has been talking about yesterday. I think people have slightly forgotten what it means to live with. You can't be blamed for forgetting, because they never experienced it. It means to live with debts of this level, government debt of this level. Right now, it's actually fine in terms of the cost of government borrowing being so low, but it's fantastically precarious. And like a war, it's almost as big as a war in this respect. It'll take years and years to put back to rights in terms of public finances. And that, of course, greatly limits what the government can do in the coming years. And it greatly limits what we human beings can do. How much money we'll have to invest, how much confidence we can have in investment, how much we can think of the future, how much we can spend rather than save. Actually, also how much we can save, because you may not have the money to save, and you may get a very poor rate of return on your savings. So you're actually caught. Most members of the public will be caught between not wanting to spend and not being able to save. These are all very awkward things which are going to strike at our capacity to innovate, and will tend to make more people dependent on the state, and to make the country, and therefore most people, poorer. And that's reflected in a broader situation across the Western world too. So it's when Mrs Thatcher was coming in, she was dealing with problems which were sort of unique to Britain about trade union power. I mean, they did exist in other countries, but less. This time, and that made it easier for her to get out of it in a way, because she could draw on a fairly strong Western economic system. Now we're all in deep doo-doo, as I think President Bush the first used that phrase, therefore we do need something quite visionary about how to move out of it. And all the Chancellor has given us, which is perhaps all he can give us right now, is to show the depth of the problem. But I don't think we have any strong sense of an economic theory or strategy which would lead us through it and get us all moving again. And I think above all, giving the freedom to British enterprise so that it can get on with it, rather than the government trying to demand that money be spent here or there, or that the government somehow can take the lead in enterprise. That's not how it works at all.
So is Boris Johnson lacking a sort of free market vision? Is that, I mean, I know The Spectator, I think, for example, recently has criticised him and his government for failing to have a sort of overarching political ideology by which he can sort of unite his own MPs and get his get the country behind his agenda.
Yes, I mean, you do have to, in a crisis, an emergency such as COVID is a classic example of where the government needs to do much more than usual. I do believe that. I don't believe with the libertarians that you can just say, oh, we'll just let everybody get on with it and it will find a level. I think a public health crisis of this dimension does need strong government action. But the trouble is, if you don't maintain your basic ideology about trying to free up the citizens, you'll just get more and more demands for more and more money spent on everything all the time, including more and more people living on welfare. And you'll make it harder and harder to get out of the problem you've got into, and you will be digging a deeper trench for yourself. And somehow we haven't begun to think about this. So, for example, to take quite a tough example, actually, but I think it's important, why would the living wage, so-called, go up at this time? You know, it gets harder and harder for private sector employers to have the money to pay. So if you have compulsory wage rises, they will employ fewer people. It must be so. And then you'll get more unemployment, and then you'll get more discontent, obviously, and less enterprise. And so it goes on. You think of all these things through, and you think of how much resistance there is to common sense. I mean, Rishi Sunak is taking actually quite a moderate position on cutting the overseas aid budget, for example. But you think the world was coming to an end the way that critics talk about it. No investigation of the immense waste in that budget, no investigation of the extraordinary thing that it's insisted on by law that we have to pay 0.7% of GDP every year, that no other form of spending is institutionalized in that way. And no sense of a return for Britain in all of that. And yet people get so worried. Similarly, I personally would be very critical of the government for, I think they're doing basically the right thing about overseas aid, but I think they're doing the wrong thing in the climate change agenda. Because if you massively multiply the costs of energy, which is what's happening, when you could actually diminish the cost of energy because of the ready availability of shale oil and gas, you will impoverish the country relatively. And energy charges are a charge on, the word energy gives you the clue, that they're a charge on what people do and how people work and how the world goes round. And we are relentlessly, and it's going to get worse soon, putting up these charges when we could be not exactly putting them down, but allowing them not to rise, because the natural production of energy would come at fairly low cost. So we are doing perverse things and taking some sort of pride in that, which seems to me mistaken.
Well, on this last point, and I want to be relatively brief about this because I do want to talk about the Crown as well, but this last point about Boris's enthusiasm to do with climate change and, issues like I think they've talked about a green industrial revolution and as banning petrol cars by 2030 and things like that. A lot of people put this down to Boris Johnson's girlfriend, Carrie Symonds, who's a huge climate campaigner. She worked for the Conservative Party for a while. She's got a lot of contacts in the media. And there was this whole row to do with Carrie Symonds versus Dominic Cummings and Lee Cain, who are obviously very important advisors to the Prime Minister, who resigned a few weeks ago. What do you make of this internal battle within Downing Street, and how much influence do you think Carrie Symonds holds on the Prime Minister?
I don't really know about the extent of Carrie Symonds' influence. And to be fair, it must be understood that Boris himself has always been, or generally been, of the greenish side of the argument. He's written some articles in the past as a journalist laughing at some eco madnesses, but essentially he's always defined himself as a green Tory. I think that the departure of Dominic Cummings was probably inevitable because advisors like that don't last terribly long. If you're a very powerful advisor, people pile in on you and try to get rid of you. So your very effectiveness is what frightens them. If you'd been ineffective, he'd still be there. But it is a loss because the reason his methods were abrasive was he was trying to make the government think about things that needed to be done and to give a sense of priority to things. And I'm not criticizing Carrie Simons here. I'm worried about a vacuum. I'm worried about a unclear channels of advice, muddled advice, but a lack of direction, which may already be visible. And when there is a direction, it seems to be in favor of spending much more on everything and paying later. That's quite dangerous.
On a more lighter topic, The Crown, it's a Netflix show. It's all about the Queen and the royal family. They've just released their latest series of episodes, and this series covers the 1980s. It covers Margaret Thatcher's premiership and sort of the beginning of the end of Prince Charles and Diana's marriage, or even, I think it ends in the 1990s. So I think it gets just towards the end of that marriage. What was your initial sort of impressions of how Margaret Thatcher was played and sort of how the events were perceived and presented?
This latest series has a lot about Mrs. Thatcher because it was her time in office, and so it's very interesting, the relationship between her and the Queen. I think politically, the current series is pretty bad on Margaret Thatcher. I think it largely repeats rather stale leftist things, sort of all the stuff about tearing the heart out of communities, phrases like that. It doesn't show any of the actual subtlety of what Mrs. Thatcher was doing. It doesn't show how the miners' strike was really a battle for democracy in the Union, because Arthur Scargill wouldn't let them have a ballot. And so it somehow feels as if she's the villain. She's made to look the villain of battles about South Africa and sanctions. And there's a very weird scene in which the man who famously got into the Queen's bedroom delivers a long lecture about the wickedness of Thatcherism, which the Queen appears to agree with. And first of all, obviously this didn't happen, but secondly, it's very unreal scene. However, I think that the drama of the film is good on this unique fact, which is that for the first time ever, we had a head of state, the Queen, and a head of government, Mrs. Thatcher, who were both women, and women of the same age. So they're seeing what happened to Britain at that time from their different vantage points, and then they're coming together in their roles. And there was a certain tension there, I think partly to do with the fact that they were both women who didn't naturally favor the company of women in powerful positions and were used to the company of men in those positions. So there's a certain unease there, and also some social unease, because Mrs. Thatcher came from, what the Americans would call the wrong side of the tracks, the grocer's daughter, moving into, staying at Balmoral and that sort of thing. And though all of that is exaggerated, and in the film, and though it's very unfair to the Queen, it shows her being rude to Mrs. Thatcher. And it's very unfair to Mrs. Thatcher because it shows Mrs. Thatcher being rude to the Queen, and neither of those things ever happened. It does capture something, which is that Mrs. Thatcher was feeling pretty tense about coming into an environment she knew little about and trying to run the country and to change things. Whereas the Queen, of course, I don't think was trying to resist change, but is always a figure of continuity and moderation, and always very worried by conflict. They have different roles and they're fulfilling their roles, and to some extent those roles clash. And I think that's well portrayed. It's over dramatized, but we're talking about a drama, and interesting. And I think that side of Mrs. Thatcher is well portrayed by Gillian Anderson powerfully. What it lacks, I think, is a sort of human sympathy element that Mrs. Thatcher herself showed, because one of the odd things about her was that though she was very tough and pretty foul to her cabinet colleagues, she was also on a personal level rather sort of cozy. And everybody who worked with her, or rather for her, as opposed to with her at cabinet level, liked her very much. So the drivers, the secretaries, the detectives, the private secretaries, cooks, etc., etc. She was always interested in them, and she was polite to them and rude to the big cheeses, which is a nice human quality, but can cause you trouble when there's conflict. That side of things doesn't come across at all. So I think if you knew nothing about Mrs. Thatcher, you would just think she's a hard, cold woman, though a passionate one. Those elements were there in her character, but there were other ones, and they're not really portrayed.
It's funny because a lot of people are criticizing the series for showing Margaret Thatcher to be too human and sort of humanizing her a little bit too much for their liking. I think that perhaps they're a bit blinded by certain political views of her. This idea, this sort of theme, as you've mentioned, of anti-establishment, sort of anti-elitism, does that go to the core of Margaret Thatcher's personality? And I know that they, for example, sort of tried to portray Mrs. Thatcher as being, as you say, sort of middle class and not sort of adjusting or liking the sort of upper class tendencies. And they did this through, as you say, the trip to Balmoral and things like that. Sort of this kind of anti-elite, anti-establishment, anti-upper class lady.
Like any human being, and particularly women, because it happens to women more, Mrs. Thatcher hated being patronized. And she was experiencing it a great deal in a male-dominated party of a social class on the whole higher than hers. And she knew who patronized her, and she knew who didn't. And she identified them, and she liked the ones who didn't. And so, for example, two previous Tory prime ministers, Harold Macmillan and Alec Douglas-Home, both of whom she served, both of them upper class. She much disliked Macmillan, but she very much liked Home, because she saw him as a real gentleman and somebody who was courteous to her and so on. And so I don't think she had class prejudices. She didn't think, I hate the upper classes. It wasn't like that. Similarly, she didn't hate elites because she understood the importance of very able people running things. So she had huge respect for top scientists, top intellectuals, generals, admirals, top public servants, actually. She often respected diplomats and senior civil servants, judges and so on. But what she did want to do was sort of give an electric shock to the system. And she actually didn't care about people's backgrounds. What she wanted to know was, are they up for the ride? Are they ready to do things that are worth doing? Or are they just trying to be negative, pessimistic, and stopping things? And therefore she was, in one sense, she was elitist, but she did not come from the elite. And she never got sucked into the elite. And one of the things that's very striking about Mrs. Thatcher, I think Tony Blair's good at this in a different way too, is that you could always understand what she was saying. If you're a member of the public and you're just listening to her being interviewed, watching her, she was very direct in her means of expression. She didn't talk like a government person. She talked like a person. I mean, quite an odd person, but a person. And that she never got captured by the establishment. She was constantly innovating in what she was saying, and she was using words that the public could understand and relate to, often would disagree with strongly, but they could see what all this was about. She was not one of these leaders who sort of wraps up power in a sort of smokescreen of jargon, quite the opposite. So I think she's, in class terms, a very interesting thing. She's not trying to, she was a very traditionalist British person. She admired the monarchy. She had even created hereditary peers. She had no problem about the House of Lords. She liked the romantic story of British history, so she wasn't trying to turn all that upside down. What she was trying to do was get the country going again. And to do that, you have to find the best. And the best will not necessarily come from some little crust at the top, come from anywhere. So opportunity is her big thing, not equality, opportunity. And the chance to rise and the chance to get on with things. And if people are encouraging people to rise and encouraging people to get on with things, she supports them, whatever class they are.
I'm going to ask question about similarities between her era and today's era, and sort of this idea of a stuffy elite versus what perhaps people would call today populism or sort of anti-elitism. In 2016, obviously, we voted for Brexit, and the United States went for Donald Trump for their president. And this, in many people's eyes, sort of overturned a huge establishment that had been created perhaps by Tony Blair and John Major, this sort of liberal establishment, this cozy bunch of sort of upper middle class people in the United Kingdom, for example, who were dominating institutions from the BBC to civil service to the government or wherever, cultural institutions. And then obviously the United Kingdom voted for Brexit, and Theresa May became Prime Minister and tried to sort that out. And in America, Donald Trump, who I think is even more stark and more sort of anti-elite than Brexit ever could be, he was elected over there. Do you think that there's a sort of similarity between how Margaret Thatcher, when she came to power in 1979, she sort of was overturning an elite then, versus the 2016 revolutions in both the United Kingdom and the United States?
There's some similarity, but I think there's a big difference. The trouble with populists is that usually they don't really know what to do, they just know what to say. And they're actually quite confused about their agenda. And I think in that sense, Mrs Thatcher was not a populist. She certainly said some things which appealed to the public in 1979. Get the trade unions off our backs, get the government off our backs, get Britain moving again. And she was quite strong on things like crime. She closely identified with a lot of ordinary people's wishes and fears. But she focused, the current culture of populism is so much more verbal than related to action. It's so much more sort of who can hit whom harder on Twitter. Which, and of course, Twitter didn't exist in her time. She was very serious, and in this sense, traditional as a politician, in the content of what you have to do as a government, in what actually happens when you govern. How do you frame the right law? How do you get it through? How do you administer it? How do you look after the money supply or the defense strategy? Rather than just chucking out slogans all the time and sort of being obsessed with 24-hour news media. So I think was a lot of the impetus for voting for Margaret Thatcher, particularly in 1979, was, if you like, a populist one, certainly a rebellious one. People were sick of the old consensus. That's true. She was a consensus breaker. But I think she was much more constructive than what you've tended to see in current populist movements right across the world. And I would say fundamentally more serious. I'd say she had an actual idea about what to do. And this seems to me what's lacking in both sides, both the populists and the anti-populists right now. So Trump did some good things, but essentially it was pretty wild. Biden would appear not to have any particular idea about anything, but he's experienced and not extreme. And neither of those positions are good enough, really, are they, to take the most important country in the world, and that the United States. And what we don't seem to have is political leaders who say, here's what's wrong, and here's what I propose to do about it, and they get on and try to do it.
Well, it's funny because I suppose in the 1980s, you had the Soviet Union as this kind of counterbalance, and something that a sort of very obvious thing you can look at and say, that's awful, that's a disaster, we should fight for our own values of freedom and democracy and things like that. And that's quite useful for politicians in those times, I suppose, to have an agenda and to have this kind of overarching political ideology. Whereas today it's a bit harder to see that counterbalance and that sort of enemy, as it were, to fight against, other than China. And you've mentioned this issue. Yeah. I just want to talk about China.
Yes, exactly. I was just going to say, because obviously you shouldn't be going looking for enemies, but you should be aware of fundamental differences. And China has made itself more the enemy of the West in recent years under Xi Jinping. The period of opening up to us was to some extent illusory, but even the real bits have now been threatened by Xi Jinping. And it is our enemy. I mean, it's acting like our enemy. It's a series of hostile acts to us. For example, infiltrating British universities and business, that sort of thing. All sorts of misbehavior in about intellectual property and trade of various kinds. And of course, massive repression of its own people, which it tries to conduct not only within its own country, but abroad, if it can ever manage to do so. and it's broken the agreement for one country, two systems with Hong Kong, with increasing vehemence, and it's made us all ill. It's this year we are massive losses of life and health and prosperity come from China's bungling of COVID, or failure to admit early enough what was happening, thereby spreading it. And we do need to understand, as China appears to be coming out of it earlier and quicker than us, that COVID is a victory for them and a defeat for us. And I'm afraid the difference between China and the Soviet Union is not that their type of power, both of them were totalitarian, but that China is economically successful. And that therefore is much more of a threat than the Soviet Union was to us. And it's makes our elites much more corrupt, because they are likely to be bought up by China, and whole countries can be bought up by China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example. And people are frightened of speaking out against China, and some people are paid not to speak out against China, like people on the board of Huawei in Britain or something like that. So it's actually very dangerous, because it's an economic competition and a values competition. And because the West is making a mess of things, people are more inclined to say, oh, the Chinese represent harmony while the West represents conflict. And it's not harmony, it's repression. That's what you have in China. We do have to be very, very clear about that. We have become clearer this year, but not nearly clear enough. And I think there's a serious danger that we cede ground we can't recover in all of this.
Well, just to very quickly finish the interview, I know on this issue of China, Boris Johnson has been a bit schizophrenic in some ways, and he's very keen. For example, he decided this year to not allow Huawei to, invest in our infrastructure fully. And there's sort of a date, I think, in a few years' time when they must finish their involvement in 5G internet. But then he's been very sort of consistent in saying, I'm not a China-phobic person. I'm quite keen on China. Where could this end up for him? Do you think he'll have to sort of change his views in the next few years, or do you think he'll sort of stick on this path of trying to please both camps?
I think it's perfectly sensible not to insult China gratuitously. For a start, we have no quarrel with the Chinese people. We're talking of the problems of the Chinese Communist Party, which rules the whole place. But equally, we must be frank about the differences. We can't have this pretense in which we say that a British university that's like Cambridge, for example, is dealing with a Chinese university, and that they're the same sort of thing, and you can accept Chinese money as if it had no strings attached. They're not the same sort of thing. The Chinese Communist Party controls every Chinese university. We shouldn't be letting them through the back door into Cambridge or whatever. And this goes for business, and it goes for everything in international affairs, because China is doing a massive sort of imperial diplomacy to buy up, partly through the exploitation of debt, all sorts of countries that are less powerful and less rich. It's happening all over the world. This must be recognized. We need to live with China. We don't want a war. We don't even really want a trade war. But we have to establish proper means of communication, proper playing field for trade. And we need to understand that we're being dealt with by people who spy and infiltrate and use cyber wars and repress. And we need to be calm in our rhetoric, but clear.
Thank you so much, Charles Moore, for joining us again.
Thank you, Stephen.